Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Becoming an Alpha podcast, where we will look at the different ways that we can incorporate biblical masculinity into our lives. Ladies, if you are watching, please stay, as you will not only learn different elements to look for in your prospective husbands, but you will also be able to assist your husbands more with their personal development. And more than that, you will be able to help train your sons into becoming the alphas that they were born to be. Right now, we're in the series on the non-alphas, and last week we discussed the warrior Omega. Now, the warrior Omega is an individual who is very much of a lone wolf style character. He's mastered personal competence, but he likes to avoid being connected to teams, particularly because they offer a path of vulnerability to him, and he is personally mastered self-competence in order to avoid vulnerability at all costs, making him an expression of cowardice. The next Omega we're going to go over is the diplomatic Omega. Now, the diplomatic Omega, rather than being an expression of cowardice, he's an expression of pride. In particular, he sees himself as being above his fellow man, rather than being separate from them. And he is more ambitious even than the alphas can be. As such, he spends his life trying to climb as high as he possibly can to get to the top so that he can be above all of those who will now have to serve him, or else will never be a threat to him. Either way, he's at the top of his game. Now, you may have noticed that the thumbnail for this particular video was a symbol from Star Wars, the symbol for the Sith Empire. And I chose that one because I feel that George Lucas's idea of the Sith Empire perfectly illustrates what the diplomatic Omega looks like. So we're going to look at some of the elements of the Sith Empire, see how they have reflected themselves in history and in literature and in scripture in order to find out ways that we can either avoid them or else help them to become into alphas. Now, the first element of the Sith Empire that I want to discuss is it's incredibly organized, but it's organized due to strict social structure. Once you're in your role, you stay there and you work unless you prove yourself beneficial to the one you're serving. And then maybe you can upgrade yourself. But in the end, you are still always going to be below. It's a very fascist form of organization in the social hierarchy. Now, in the Sith Empire in particular, not only did this go so far as the organization, making it sort of a caste system, but there were even others who, when they had the abilities to be of more benefit, were not even given a chance. In particular with the Sith Empire, aliens, meaning non-humans or non-Sith purebloods, were never allowed to study the ways of the Force within the Sith Empire or reach elevated rank in the Sith military corps. The belief on the part of the Sith Empire was that the fewer types of people you allowed, the fewer threats you would have to the established power. Now, the Republic, while it was not nearly as organized as the Sith Empire, their willingness to allow every single type of person to reach as high as they possibly could ended up helping them innovate numerous things and find avenues that the Sith were not able to. While not as organized, they were far more creative and innovative. Now, while they did allow the humans and the Sith purebloods to study the ways of the Force, even when that was the case, they would still brutalize them through emotional and physical abuse in order to ensure that they would never either gain the competence or the courage in order to overthrow them as their masters. This particular strategy is one that is played out numerous times in history. The first example that I want to go into is the Mesoamericans, particularly the Mayans. The Mayans were one of the greatest civilizations in the world's history. Essentially, they were the ancient Egypt of the Western Hemisphere. Now, to this very day, we can see their pyramids and their temples. We can see traces of who they were as a people, despite the fact that their empire is estimated to have died out somewhere around 900 AD. Over 1,000 years ago, their empire was wiped out through what is believed to be some crop issues due to a climate catastrophe, and as such, they were not able to feed themselves, and their empire collapsed. But still, despite all that, their empire is still standing to this very day. And many people travel to South America in order to see the remnants of this lost great civilization. But its greatness was achieved through oppression rather than through diligent cohesion. Now, this oppression took several forms. Slavery was incredibly common in the Mayan Empire. In addition to that, human sacrifice. But one way that they particularly kept their people subjugated was by forbidding them from learning special knowledge. In particular, the lords and the priests of the Mayan nation had a great understanding of astronomy, particularly when it came to eclipses. And so whenever eclipses were about to come, they would plan for them to make a huge theatrical presentation of the anger of the gods being shown to the people, and thus ensuring that they would continue to be subjugated to them for years to come, if not generations. They would exploit all different kinds of astronomical phenomenon in order to demonstrate that they had a particular understanding and closeness, intimacy with the divine, even though all they knew was the elements of nature. Now, the next one that I want to go into is one that we're all familiar with, and that is the colonial slave era. We all know how horribly the slaves were treated by many of their masters in this particular time. In fact, Willie Lynch, I don't know if you have ever heard of him, but he was one of the most abusive masters that one could ever see, and in particular, he was the instructor to many different Virginian slave masters, showing them how to break their slaves so that they'd still be effective workers, but would never want freedom. Now, first thing he would do is he would take the strongest and the most restless of them. He would strip him naked, tar and feather him, then draw and quarter him while he was set on fire in front of all of the slaves. This brutalization was so unbelievably traumatic, but it did not stop there. He would then take all of the other ones who were strong, and he would beat them mercilessly. Not enough to kill them or even to cripple them, because they could still be used for breeding, but enough to put the fear of the master's wrath into them. The philosophy was, keep the body, but take the mind, so that they could never gain what was necessary in order to desire freedom and therefore never to fight for it. But more than that, much like the Mayans, who not only brutalized their people but kept them from obtaining certain knowledge, slaves were in particular forbidden to learn how to read. And if they did know how to read, they were particularly forbidden to learn the Bible, because the Bible was an avenue by which they could learn that humans were meant to be free and not to be slaves, which is completely ironic. In this modern generation, it is viewed that the Bible says that slavery is okay. For crying out loud, President Obama, during his administration, made a speech about how he thinks the Old Testament justifies slavery, when in fact it does not. For example, in Proverbs chapter 22, verse 2, King Solomon wrote, "The rich and the poor have this in common. The Lord made them both," indicating that whatever your differences in class on this earth, you are still subject to the Father in heaven, and as such, that gives you a certain amount of equality because you are still his subjects. But this isn't the only example. In Acts chapter 17, verse 26, from one man, God has made every single nationality. Romans chapter 2, verse 11, for there is no partiality with God. Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ. And finally, Ephesians chapter 6. This is the part that a lot of people like to say endorses slavery because it tells slaves to be subservient to their masters. But look at what it says to the masters immediately after them. Treat them, your slaves, without threatening them, because their master and your master is in heaven. See, back in the biblical times, slavery was not a form of chattel property. In fact, in Exodus chapter 21, it was made a crime under Mosaic law for you to kidnap anyone and then sell them into slavery, punishable by death. But to this day, people think that the Bible is in fact in favor of slavery, when the colonial slave owners specifically prevented their slaves from learning anything about the Bible because they were afraid that they would want to become free. Now, these are the different examples throughout history of, or rather the most classic examples of how diplomatic omegas will often weaken and keep the people under them in states of ignorance so that they could never have a chance of subverting their power. But in addition to that, diplomatic omegas also see the people as tools underneath them. And in terms of the Sith, I think the greatest example of this is the classic Darth Vader himself. particularly his relationship with his own apprentice, Starkiller, otherwise known as Galen Marek. Darth Vader found Galen Marek on the planet of Kashyyyk after murdering his father. He saw that the boy was strong with the Force, took him in, indoctrinated him in the ways of the Sith, and trained him to be an effective warrior. Ostensibly, he was doing so because he wanted to use this person in order to help him overthrow the Emperor, Darth Sidious. Now, he had proven himself able, but Darth Sidious found out about the apprentice, and so Darth Vader, to try to show his loyalty to Sidious, made a show off of killing him. But he made sure that the droids would take him and rebuild him so that his death would not be permanent. And he told him, the only way that we're going to be able to take out Darth Sidious is if we create a distraction for his spies, because that's how he beat us last time. So I want you to assemble a group of rebels who can distract the Emperor's attention. Galen Marek does several things in order to prove the Empire's vulnerability to gain the maximum amount of rebel support possible. He destroys a skyhook on Kashyyyk. He destroys a Sarlacc mine on Felucia and a shipyard on Raxus Prime. All incredibly valuable targets, resulting in the deaths of thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of stormtroopers who served the Empire loyally. And when Starkiller finally gathered the rebels together, Darth Vader came in, arrested the rebels, and tried to kill Starkiller once more, informing him that he had never planned to destroy the Emperor with Starkiller. He was just a ploy, a pawn. Ever since he was a child and Darth Vader took him from his father and murdered his father, he was merely a pawn in order to find anyone who would be in rebellion to Darth Sidious, and so he could flesh them out and bring them to the Emperor's wrath. Now, this particularly is so disgusting because Darth Vader was using this individual as a piece in a game. And the entire show of Game of Thrones is centered around the idea of using people as pieces rather than as the ones you are supposed to serve, with the exception of individuals like Ned Stark or Lord Varys. Now, in the show Person of Interest, the creator of this all-knowing machine, Harold Finch, is teaching the machine how to play chess. And he said that the lesson in chess is to not play the game. Particularly what he meant by that was that you cannot view people as things you can sacrifice. They are instead there for you to protect and to serve. Another example of a person, a diplomatic omega, using people as tools rather than as the objects of his service actually comes from Scripture. Rehoboam, the son of King Solomon, the wisest of all kings, and the grandson of King David, one of the godliest of all kings. Now, towards the latter end of King Solomon's reign, he had become a very oppressive ruler. He had wanted to create so many beautiful forms of architecture, but to do that, he required a boatload of workers. And so in order to get them, he would actually subjugate his own people into coerced service. And when he did so, he had several forced laborers who would keep them in line, and the people grew restless, but they were also loyal to the legacy of David. So when Rehoboam was going to ascend to the throne after his father's death, they went to him and they said, "We will serve you if you will just lighten the heavy yoke that your father put on us." And Rehoboam said, "Give me 3 days to think about it and I'll give you an answer." And the first people that Rehoboam went to were the ministers and advisors who had been with his father, King Solomon. And he asked them, "What should I say to them?" And the minister said, "Be a servant to them and serve them, and they will serve you in return." But Rehoboam rejected this advice, instead going along with the advice of the friends he had grown up with, who said, "You're the king. So if they want to come to you saying that their yoke's too painful, just show them how painful it can get." And so Rehoboam went to the people and he said, "My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. You say my father made your yoke heavy, I will make it heavier. You say my father scourged you with whips, I will scourge you with barbed whips." And so, as a result, the people rebelled against him, and he lost 10 out of the 12 tribes that he was given to rule. And this is something about diplomatic omegas that they very often cannot see until it is too late. Being an oppressor is only temporary in its power, because oppressing people sooner or later builds up enough strength for them to overthrow you. And as a result, it will always come back to bite you. Oppressed people, time after time after time again throughout history, have constantly rebelled against their oppressors after enough generations of toil, because they know it is no way for them to live their lives. Despite their fear and despite their anguish, they gain the courage necessary to go out and fight them, so that they can once more be the alphas in their lives rather than being subjugated to the diplomatic omegas. Now, President Snow, in the Hunger Games book series, he actually made an interesting comment on this particular point. When Katniss Everdeen had fired an arrow towards the judges who were evaluating her for this horrific set of trials known as the Hunger Games, they gave her a high score, and Snow was not happy about this. And so Snow talked to the head judge, and he said, "Why did you give her such a high score?" And they said, "Well, she was impressive." And President Snow said, "Be careful, because why do you think in these trials we let there be a winner? Because if we truly wanted to subjugate them through fear, why not gather up the people for the trials and just execute them on the spot? It'd be simpler." And the reason is because of hope. The one thing more powerful than fear is hope. A little bit of hope is effective, but a lot of hope is dangerous. Spark is fine, as long as you can keep it contained. And so he told Seneca Crane to make sure that it was contained. But instead, she ended up triumphing. And as a result, that hope that President Snow had for almost 50 years kept in front of the people, but never letting them touch it. And so they always fell into the deepest and darkest pits of despair. It was grasped by Katniss Everdeen. She had managed to take it out of President Snow's hand, and as such, she became the inspiration by which a rebellion took place. And this is always the gamble that the diplomatic omegas have to make. You can either oppress them so much that they rise up against you, or you can oppress them just enough so that they think that there may be a chance when really there is none. But it's an incredibly delicate balance that the diplomatic omegas are consistently making in order to maintain their power, in the tyrannical fashion in which they abuse it. But there is another form of the diplomatic omega, one who is not necessarily motivated by malicious tyranny, but is instead motivated by a different kind of pride, the pride to believe he is the only solution. Now, this comes in the form sometimes of the cult leader, or simply the one who cannot sacrifice his power. For example, Thanos in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. He sees what he believes to be inevitable doom caused by lack of resource coming to the universe. And as a result, he believes it is his job to wipe out half of the population so that they will find balance again with nature, and they will not have to be wiped out completely. Unfortunately, what he is missing is another aspect of God's commandments. You see, the previous diplomatic omega that we discussed, he is one who cannot follow the commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. But this diplomatic omega cannot follow the commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. Because what he has failed to realize is that there is a God, that God holds the entire universe in his hands. He is so focused on aspects of philosophy like what Mordecai said to Esther, who knows if perhaps you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. This particular type of diplomatic omega is obsessed with the fact that he is the chosen one, that he is the one who must save the world, and if he is having a difficult time doing it, then he must do whatever it takes. There can't be any limits, because he has to be the one to achieve this. But what he forgets is the previous part of Mordecai's message to Esther. The full statement that he said to her is, do not think that by keeping silent at such a time, you will escape the fate of any of the others. For if you keep silent, God will find a way to save us. But you will surely perish. For who knows whether or not you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. And that statement, if you keep silence, God will find another way to deliver us. Mordecai's faith was strong because he knew who God was. That God is one who is never out of control. That he always knows how to keep things in balance. And he continuously works to do so while respecting human free will. And when Jesus comes for the second time, he will establish a permanent balance over the universe. One without the corruption of sin and of chaos. And so we will be ruled under the greatest Alpha of all time, Jesus Christ. Now, in our modern society, we have made several identifications of diplomatic omegas. For example, the robber barons, as I have mentioned. The robber barons were individuals who showed no scruples and simply wanted to enrich themselves at the expense of others. And as such, there have been several social movements against them. But these social movements have not always led to the destruction of the diplomatic omegas, but instead the reorganization of their power under different ones. Excuse me. And the greatest example of this is the Democratic Party and the urban black population. You see, the Democratic Party was originally the party of slavery, the party of the KKK, who spent centuries keeping African Americans down through brute force, through emotionally traumatic events, all to ensure that they could not rise up and find their freedom, depriving them of God's word in order to ensure that this was achieved. But once they had their freedom, their strategy shifted. Instead of trying to prove that they could not do anything right by beating them down into submission, they instead simply just told them. They acknowledged the racist state of the country and then said, well, you can't do anything as long as it's like this. But then they kept telling them that, even when several solutions were implemented, they just kept telling them, you're being kept down. You're being kept down. You can't achieve anything. You need assistance in order to do so because on your own, you have nothing. But unlike President Snow, who, while keeping just enough hope there, while keeping it out of people's reach, that strategy was good, but where it was flawed was that everyone knew that he was the source of all their oppression. What the Democrats have done, and this is rather brilliant of them, they have instead said, look over there. They have created numerous scapegoats as the source of this so-called oppression. And they have implemented things that are supposedly to help those individuals overcome, but instead have enslaved them on a new plantation, keeping them, as Willie Lynch said, dependent upon the masters. For example, the welfare state. More welfare goes to poor single mothers than poor families. On the one hand, you might say, well, that makes sense. Single mothers have less source of income, and as such, they need more assistance. And that may be true enough. But what's missing from this is the fact that this encourages the behavior of single motherhood. And single motherhood is the number one indicator that the child is going to end up either poor or criminal or failing in school or emotionally damaged. A two-parent household is incredibly vital. But the Democratic Party has set up systems where having a single mother home is rewarded rather than assisted in her finding a husband to be a part of the family. The next example is affirmative action. And in affirmative action, they're not even trying to hide anymore what their belief about African Americans is. For example, the news network Vice released a documentary about affirmative action, and they said that if affirmative action is taken away, we will just see universities returning to being filled with nothing but white men. Because heaven knows, if African Americans try it on their own, apparently they can't make it. That is the legitimate belief of the Democratic Party, that without assistance, they can't make it. And so they are still racists. But they're racist under the guise of those seeking to assist them rather than to oppress them. And then finally, they will submit such contradictory statements, saying we need to take away your guns because you don't need to defend yourselves, and at the same time saying we need to defend the police because all they are is oppressors. And in the meanwhile, the communities are left with no protectors, and as such, crime riddles the streets. Chicago, to this day, has some of the strictest gun laws possible and has restricted their police force in many ways, and it is the highest gun crime and the highest death of the black population at the hands of criminals. And so as a result, instead of helping young black men become alphas, rise up to the occasion, and continue to build families and spread the news of God's word, and to innovate and serve and help society become better and stronger, they have instead moved them to a completely new plantation. Solving the issue to Snow's Gamble, how much hope to give them before it gets to be too much. Because the black vote started voting for the Democratic Party in the 1930s, and to this day, despite the fact that their situations have not changed and have only gotten worse, they still remain loyal, which is one of the saddest results of all this. But another social movement against the diplomatic omegas is the idea of redistributing wealth. To take the wealth from the diplomatic omegas and give it back to the people so that the people can actually be empowered in order to become great themselves. Now, I will admit, this part is not a idea that comes out of malice or ignorance. It is true that there are many people out there who simply do not have resources or opportunities in order to become great. But they could if they were given the chance. However, this is not the solution for one particular reason. When you take the wealth from those who are rich, it does not immediately go to the poor. It instead has a middleman that it must reach first. And that middleman is very often a heavily powerful bureaucracy that is very often filled with other diplomatic omegas. The greatest example of this is Stalin in the Soviet Union, Mao Zedong in China, of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. All of these people went on campaigns of redistributing the wealth. And then once the wealth got taken from the rich, it dissolved, going into the pockets of the men who had it. And what's more than that is the wealth could no longer be generated because it was taken by the people who had contributed nothing to the generation of the wealth in the first place. They knew not how to generate wealth, or they had never done so in their life, and yet they considered themselves the authorities on how the wealth should be distributed. And this is why ultimately, and this is a reason that Marx breaks down, because he does not understand that at the middle step, where the wealth is taken from the rich and given to the bureaucrats who will distribute it supposedly to the poor, he runs into human nature, where when you are given that much power and authority over that much wealth, the temptation to be a diplomatic omega is simply too great. And so all of these social movements, they are well-intentioned, and the fight against diplomatic omegas is incredibly vital. Over-industrialization leading to environmental catastrophe, it is a concern, and there are things we need to do to address it. But seeking to absolutely destroy the idea of generating wealth and seeking to punish them completely so that no wealth can further be generated is not the solution. Instead, the solution that we really need is to create alphas who will supplant and replace them. Now, one example in fiction of this is from the show Avatar: The Last Airbender, particularly in the Fire Nation. The Fire Nation at this time was being ruled by a diplomatic omega named Fire Lord Ozai. Ozai was an individual who wanted to promote his greatness and the greatness of his nation, willing to use many of his soldiers as tools and pawns who would be sacrificed like pieces on a chessboard. And he was successful, but he was also tyrannical, especially to people who were not of his nation. And the solution to that was not the overthrow of the entire system, as these different social movements that we have today would like us to believe. Instead, the solution was we need an alpha to take his place. The solution to having a corrupt fire lord, a corrupt king, essentially, was to replace him with a better king. Much like in Man in the Iron Mask. In that story, Louis XIV was being an incredible tyrant, and so the musketeers, Aramis, Athos, and Porthos, sought to replace him with another who would be honorable, just, and wise. the only solution to the diplomatic omega is to replace him with an alpha. And Zuko in particular learned the most essential attributes of being an alpha. He already, as a warrior omega, was incredibly personally competent, even though he was a lone wolf. But when he was informed that his banishment was no longer contingent upon him capturing the Avatar, but instead it was simply a permanent state of being, he had to rebuild his life. And he did so among the poorest members of the Earth Kingdom, who were the most attacked by the Fire Nation. And while doing so, he learned the plight of the poor. He learned the struggle of those who he should have been serving. And his heart grew, and he began to gain some of the attributes of an alpha that could lead him to becoming a great Fire Lord himself. But even so, he was incredibly loyal to his father, and in the end, he started to serve his father again when he had the chance. Because he loved his father so much, and he just thought that if he could have his father's love, things would be better. But that was not the case. And his final transition into being an alpha occurred when his uncle Iroh told him a story of how, in this war, he has a spiritual stake. Not just in the fate of the Fire Nation, but also in the fate of the Avatar. For Zuko was a descendant of both the Fire Lord who began the war, Fire Lord Sozin, and the previous Avatar, Avatar Roku. And he showed Prince Zuko that it is your job as a prince and as a member of these two great warriors to find the balance between them. Not to simply be an oppressor or one who seeks glory for himself, but to find balance and to be a servant. And so Prince Zuko became an alpha, and he helped overthrow his father and his sister, who was about to become the new Fire Lord. He fought her, and he was successful with the help of his friend Katara, and as a result he became the new Fire Lord who governed his nation wisely and well. But this is not only limited to fiction. In history, we have another example, the classic example of King George III oppressing the American colonies, and George Washington being the one who would replace him in a way. George Washington had an incredibly humble heart. He wasn't the best general, but he was still competent, and he never abandoned his men. During the French and Indian War, when he and General Braddock were moving up to fight against Fort Duquesne, General Braddock was killed in an ambush, as well as many of their men. All of the officers who were above George Washington fled to save their own skin, but George Washington stayed, reorganized the men, and got them to a place of safety because he was loyal to them. And then, when there was a rebellion that was about to happen after we had become a new nation and the war against the British had been won, there were soldiers who had not been paid, and they were frustrated because they had given so much for their country, and it looked like they weren't ever going to get a paycheck for all that they had served. And so George Washington, he was asked to read an address from Congress to these men to assure them that they would be paid. And he went up to them, and the men were silent, waiting to hear what this great man had to say. And he could not read the letter, so he took out his glasses, which at the time was a bit of a sign of weakness because it meant you were getting on in years and your prime was behind you. And he said to his men, "I apologize, but I have grown old and blind in the service of my country." He took his glasses off and put the letter back in his pocket, never even read it, and walked out the door. And the rebellion was dead. For they saw how much he had sacrificed, not just for the nation and the Congress, but for them as well. They knew he had a servant's heart, and if he was willing to be patient and wait, because he did not receive any pay from Congress by choice. The only thing that he asked Congress for was the compensation of his expenses in terms of artillery and such. But he himself received not a penny, because this was about service for him. And all of these solutions, again, between the warrior omega and the diplomatic omega, ultimately come back to you need to be an alpha in your life. You need to understand, just as Zuko did, that he must learn to serve his neighbors and the divine order of the universe. So you must learn to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. And you must learn to love your neighbor as yourself. And as you pursue this, you will become the alpha you were born to be. Diplomatic omegas, unfortunately, an alpha supplanting them is usually the only way that they can gain the humility in order to learn how to go down this path. But I urge you, if you are not currently engaged in service to your fellow man, do so. I know you have strength, and I know that strength can be of use. As King Arthur said, played by Sean Connery in First Knight, in serving one another, we become free. And it is the same way. As the advisors told Rehoboam, learn to serve others, and others will serve you in return. Use your strengths to lift them up, and they will be there for you when you are needed. George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life is another prime example of that. A man who sacrificed his honeymoon so that the people could have some money to help them get through the hard times. And then when he was broke and his company was failing and he had nothing else, the entire community rallied around him so that they could offer him the same support that he had given them. And so I urge you, if you are an Omega and you see yourself as a lone wolf, or even as one who simply wishes to attain the power so that you no longer have to answer for anyone, I promise you, you're not on your way to a fulfilled life. Because at the end of the day, we are called to be of service. And what is the point of gaining materially if you cannot do anything useful with it? Now, next week, we're going to go over the betas. Betas are very often the response to the diplomatic omegas, and we will study them and see how they are lacking on the quest to become an alpha. Thank you all for watching. Please subscribe and like if you want to see more content. I love doing this with you. Thank you so much for your support, and I hope that you have a blessed day. God be with you.